She thought she was hugging a stranger to escape her awful date, but that stranger turned out to be one of the city's most powerful millionaires. Would you dare fake family ties in public? Before we begin, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The fluorescent lights of Mel's diner buzzed like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across cracked vinyl booths that had seen better decades. Lydia Cullen pressed her palm against her lower back, feeling the familiar ache that came with pulling double shifts. Her sneakers squeaked against the checkered linoleum as she refilled the coffee pot for the 100th time that day, the bitter aroma no longer registering in her exhausted senses. "Table 6 needs more cream," barked Gordon, the perpetually grumpy cook whose apron bore stains that could tell the diner's entire history. Lydia nodded, tucking a rebellious strand of dark hair behind her ear. The ponytail she'd started with 12 hours ago had long since surrendered to gravity and humidity. Her phone buzzed against her hip. Another text from her roommate Stella. "How's the blind date going? Please tell me Mr. Crypto is better in person." Lydia's stomach dropped. The blind date. She'd completely forgotten in the chaos of covering for 2 other waitresses who'd called in sick. Her gaze swept across the diner until she spotted him. A man in an ill-fitting polo shirt waving enthusiastically from booth 3, his receding hairline glistening under the harsh lighting. "You must be Lydia," he called out, his voice carrying across the entire restaurant. Several patrons turned to stare. "I'm Brad." "Sorry, I'm early. I was just so excited to meet you." Lydia forced a smile, her server training kicking in. "Hi, Brad. Let me just finish up here and I'll be right over." As she approached his table, Brad launched into what could only be described as a verbal assault. "You look different from your photos. Not bad different, just different. Anyway, I was just telling the guy at the counter about my latest investment. Dogecoin is about to explode. I'm talking moon levels here. I've already made 15,000 this month alone." Lydia slid into the booth across from him, immediately regretting every life choice that had led to this moment. Brad barely paused for breath as he continued his financial autobiography, gesturing wildly with hands that smelled strongly of cheap cologne. "The key is knowing when to hold and when to fold, you know? Most people don't have the guts for high-risk investments, but I've got killer instincts. Last week, I liquidated my entire savings to go all in on this new cryptocurrency called SafeMoon. The name says it all, right?" "Right," Lydia murmured, scanning the diner for any possible escape route. Her shift didn't end for another hour, and she was trapped in social hell with a man who apparently thought cryptocurrency was foreplay. "Of course, I don't expect you to understand the complexities of modern finance," Brad continued, not bothering to touch the coffee she'd poured him. "Most women prefer traditional investments, shoes, handbags, that sort of thing. But don't worry, once we're serious, I'll handle all our financial decisions." The coffee cup in Lydia's hands creaked under her grip. "Our financial decisions?" "Well, naturally. I assume that's where this is heading, right? Stella said you were looking for something serious. I've got to warn you though, I'm pretty selective. I don't usually date waitresses, but Stella convinced me to make an exception." Heat flooded Lydia's cheeks. She'd known Stella since college, but clearly hadn't known her well enough to trust her judgment in men. Brad was still talking, something about his mother's house in New Jersey and his plans to move out eventually, when Lydia's attention was captured by movement at the counter. A man in an expensive blue suit was paying his check, moving with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested he'd never had to convince anyone of his worth. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and even from across the diner, she could see the quality of his tailoring. He looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine, the kind that featured articles about private jets and Swiss watches. Desperate inspiration struck. "Oh my God!" Lydia exclaimed, jumping up from the booth so suddenly that Brad's coffee sloshed across the table. "I can't believe it!" Without giving herself time to reconsider, she strode across the diner and threw her arms around the stranger's shoulders. He tensed for a microsecond before she felt his body relax, his hands coming up to pat her back with surprising gentleness. "Thank God you're here, brother," she said loudly enough for Brad to hear, pulling back to look into the most striking pair of grey eyes she'd ever seen. Up close, he was even more devastating: sharp cheekbones, a mouth that suggested both danger and humor, and an expression of amused curiosity that made her stomach flutter in ways Brad never could. The stranger's lips curved into a slow smile that was equal parts wicked and delighted. "Sister," he said in a voice like aged whiskey, rich and smooth with just a hint of smokiness. "I was wondering when you'd notice me." Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd expected confusion, maybe annoyance. Certainly not this immediate willingness to play along. His hand settled on the small of her back, a touch that was both protective and intimate. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, still pressed close to his chest. "My date is a nightmare and you look like someone who could handle pretending to be my brother for 5 minutes. "Just 5 minutes?" He tilted his head, studying her face, which made her skin tingle. "I'm Julian, by the way. And I have to say, this is the most interesting thing that's happened to me all week." "Lydia," she breathed, suddenly very aware that they were standing impossibly close in the middle of a diner, and that Brad was approaching with the determined stride of a man whose ego had been bruised. "Excuse me," Brad interrupted, his chest puffed out in what Lydia assumed was meant to be an intimidating manner. "But Lydia and I were in the middle of a conversation." Julian turned, keeping one arm around Lydia's waist, and the temperature in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop several degrees. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that came from boardrooms and corner offices. "I'm afraid there's been a family emergency," Julian said smoothly, not even bothering to look intimidated by Brad's posturing. "Lydia needs to come with me immediately." "Family emergency," Brad sputtered. "But we just ordered. And I was telling her about my investment portfolio." "How devastating for her," Julian replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure she'll treasure the memory forever." Lydia pressed her lips together to keep from laughing. She grabbed her purse from behind the counter, calling over to Gordon. "Family emergency, can you cover my last hour?" Gordon, who'd been watching the entire exchange with undisguised entertainment, waved her off. "Go handle your business, girl. That crypto boy looks like he's about to cry." Indeed, Brad's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "This is ridiculous. Stella said you were serious about finding a relationship." "Oh, I am," Lydia called over her shoulder as Julian guided her toward the door. "Just not with someone who thinks Dogecoin is a personality trait." The cool evening air hit her face like a blessing as they stepped onto the sidewalk. The diner's sign cast pink and blue shadows across the cracked pavement, and for the first time in hours, Lydia could breathe properly. "That," Julian said, releasing her waist but not stepping away, "was masterfully executed. I can't believe I just did that." Lydia ran her hands through her hair, dislodging the remnants of her ponytail completely. "I'm not usually the type to throw myself at strange men in expensive suits." "Expensive suits?" She gestured at his attire. "That's not off the rack from Men's Warehouse." Julian laughed, a sound that was rich and genuine. "Observant. Most people wouldn't notice. Most people you know probably wear suits like that every day." "Touché." He studied her face in the neon glow, and she felt exposed under his gaze, as if he could see past her exhaustion and coffee-stained uniform to something deeper. "So Lydia, what exactly did Crypto Boy do to deserve such dramatic rejection? Where do I start?" He spent 20 minutes explaining why women can't understand finance, then informed me he doesn't usually date waitresses but was making an exception. "Oh, and he liquidated his savings for something called Safe Moon." Julian winced. "Safe Moon? That's not investment strategy, that's gambling with extra steps." "You know about cryptocurrency? I know about bad decisions and desperation. Both tend to be expensive." There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience. But before Lydia could probe further, the diner door burst open and Brad emerged, looking around wildly. "I should probably go back inside," Lydia said reluctantly. "Face the music and finish my shift." "Or," Julian said, pulling out his phone and handing her a business card, "you could let me buy you dinner somewhere that doesn't serve coffee in cracked mugs. As a thank you for the most entertaining 10 minutes of my month." Lydia stared at the card. The paper was thick, expensive, with elegant lettering that read, "Julian Cross, Cross Holdings." No title, no flashy descriptions. Just a name and a company that sounded vaguely familiar. "Cross Holdings," she murmured. "Why do I know that name?" "Real estate development. We're probably responsible for half the overpriced condos you can't afford in the city." His honesty was refreshing after Brad's braggadocio, but it also reminded her of the vast chasm between their worlds. She was a waitress. He was the kind of man who could probably buy the entire diner without checking his bank balance. "I appreciate the offer," she said, handing the card back. "But I don't think we exactly run in the same circles." Julian didn't take the card. Instead, he stepped closer, and she caught a hint of his cologne. Something subtle and expensive that made her think of leather and cedar and things she couldn't afford. "Circles are overrated," he said quietly. "Most of the people in mine are about as interesting as your crypto enthusiast. At least you had the creativity to stage a rescue." "When's the last time anyone surprised me like that?" Lydia felt her resolve wavering. There was something magnetic about Julian Cross, something that made her want to forget about practical concerns and different social classes. But she'd learned the hard way that fairy tales were called fiction for a reason. "I really should get back," she said, though she made no move to leave. "Of course." Julian stepped back, giving her space. "But keep the card. Just in case you ever need a fake brother again." Lydia laughed despite herself. "Is that a service you offer regularly?" "For you, I might consider expanding my business model." The flirtation in his voice sent warmth through her chest. This was dangerous territory, the kind of attraction that could make a sensible woman forget about rent and responsibilities, and the fact that men like Julian Cross didn't seriously date women like her. "Thank you," she said, pocketing the card. "For playing along, I mean. You probably saved me from death by boredom." The pleasure was entirely mine. As she turned to walk back toward the diner, she felt his eyes on her, a weight that made her hyper-conscious of every step. At the door, she couldn't resist looking back. Julian was still there, hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Their eyes met across the distance, and he raised one hand in a small wave. Lydia's heart did something in her chest before she forced herself to push through the diner door. Brad was nowhere to be seen, though she spotted a $20 bill left on their table. Apparently his idea of covering both the coffee and his wounded pride. Gordon raised an eyebrow as she tied her apron back on. "That boy in the suit looked like he could buy this whole place," he observed. "Probably could," Lydia agreed, checking her tables and trying to ignore the way her fingers kept drifting to the business card in her pocket. "You gonna call him? Don't be ridiculous. Men like that don't date women like me." Gordon snorted. "Men like that don't rescue strange women from bad dates either, but I just watched it happen with my own eyes." Lydia spent the rest of her shift replaying the encounter, analyzing every word and gesture. Julian's smile, the way he'd immediately understood what she needed, the casual confidence with which he'd dismissed Brad's protests, the warmth of his hand on her back, the way he'd smelled like expensive things. By the time she finally hung up her apron and headed home to her cramped studio apartment, she'd convinced herself it had been a fluke. A moment of spontaneous chemistry that would fade in the harsh light of reality. Men like Julian Cross lived in houses and drove cars worth thousands of dollars. They dated socialites and heiresses, not exhausted waitresses. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the business card on her nightstand, she couldn't shake the memory of grey eyes and a voice like whiskey, or the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious and rare. Outside her window, the city hummed with late-night energy, sirens and car horns, and the distant sound of laughter from the bars down the street. Somewhere out there, Julian Cross was probably in his own world of expensive restaurants and private clubs, already forgetting about the waitress who'd thrown herself into his arms. But Lydia fell asleep remembering the way he'd said her name, like it was something worth savoring. 3 days later, Lydia had almost convinced herself that the encounter with Julian Cross had been some kind of caffeine-induced hallucination. She'd worked another double shift, her feet ached in ways that defied medical explanation, and she had exactly $37 in her checking account until her next paycheck. The morning rush at Mel's Diner was in full swing. Construction workers demanding coffee strong enough to wake the dead, office workers grabbing breakfast sandwiches while scrolling through their phones, and the usual collection of regulars who treated the diner like their personal social club. Lydia moved through the familiar choreography of service, refilling coffee cups and taking orders while her mind wandered to the notebook hidden in her locker. She'd filled 3 pages with a news story the night before, something about a mysterious stranger who appeared just when someone needed rescuing. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Order up," Gordon bellowed from the kitchen, sliding 2 plates of eggs Benedict across the pass. Lydia grabbed them, balancing the hot plates with practiced ease as she navigated between tables. She was reaching for the coffee pot when the door chimed, seeing a group that made every head in the diner turn. 3 men in expensive suits moved with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested serious money and even more serious business. They looked like they'd stepped out of a boardroom and into the wrong decade, their polished shoes clicking against the worn linoleum. And leading them, looking completely at ease despite being catastrophically overdressed for Mel's Diner, was Julian Cross. Lydia's hand froze on the coffee pot handle. He looked even better than she remembered. The suit had been replaced by navy blue one, his hair was perfectly styled despite the morning humidity, and when his eyes found hers across the crowded restaurant, that slow smile spread across his face like he'd been looking for her all his life. "Good morning," he said as the group approached the hostess station, though his attention was entirely focused on Lydia. "Table for 3, please." Marge, the day hostess who'd been working at the diner since the Carter administration, looked up from her crossword puzzle with undisguised skepticism. "You boys sure you're in the right place? There's a fancy hotel restaurant 6 blocks that way." "This is exactly where we want to be," Julian assured her, his gaze never leaving Lydia's face. "We've heard excellent things about the service." Heat flooded Lydia's cheeks as she realized he'd deliberately chosen to sit in her section. The other waitresses were staring, and she could practically hear the gossip mill grinding into motion. Men in $1,000 suits didn't just wander into Mel's Diner by accident. "Right this way," Marge said, grabbing 3 menus and leading them to a corner booth. As they passed, Julian's fingers brushed against Lydia's arm, a touch so brief she might have imagined it, except for the electricity that shot straight to her core. "I'll be right with you," she managed, proud of how steady her voice sounded, despite the fact that her heart was performing gymnastics. She took her time approaching their table, using the extra minutes to study Julian's companions. The older man had silver hair and sharp eyes that suggested he didn't suffer fools gladly. The younger one was probably close to her age, with the kind of aggressive handsomeness that belonged in cologne advertisements. "Gentlemen," she said, pulling out her order pad with hands that barely trembled. "Welcome to Mel's. Can I start you off with some coffee?" "Please," the older man said with a slight southern accent. "Black, strong enough to strip paint." "Same for me," added the younger man, though his attention was clearly divided between the menu and Lydia herself. Julian was the last to speak, and when he did, his voice carried just enough warmth to make her skin tingle. "I'll have whatever you recommend, Lydia." Using her name felt intimate in a way that made her hyper-aware of every eye in the diner. The older man raised an eyebrow, clearly noting the familiarity, while his younger companion looked between them with growing interest. "The coffee's good," she said, proud of how professional she sounded. "Fresh pot every 30 minutes. Coffee it is then." Julian's smile widened. "And maybe some of that famous diner wisdom I've heard so much about." Lydia bit back a laugh. "Wisdom's extra. Coffee's $2.50. Worth every penny, I'm sure." As she poured their coffee, she was acutely conscious of Julian watching her every move. His attention felt like a physical touch, warm and assessing and entirely too distracting for someone who was supposed to be working. "So," the older man said once she'd moved on to another table, his voice carrying clearly across the diner, "this is where you've been disappearing to." Lydia pretended to be absorbed in wiping down tables, but every word of their conversation seemed amplified. Julian's laugh was low and amused, the kind of sound that made her think of dark rooms and shared secrets. "Just expanding my horizons, Marcus. You know how I feel about trying new things." "New things," the younger man repeated with obvious amusement. "Is that what we're calling it?" "Careful, Blake." Julian's voice carried a warning. "Some topics require more discretion than others." 20 minutes later, after they'd ordered breakfast, and she'd managed to serve 3 other tables without completely embarrassing herself, Julian approached the counter where she was preparing a fresh pot of coffee. "Fancy meeting you here," he said quietly, leaning against the counter in a way that created an intimate bubble around them, despite the crowded restaurant. "It's almost like I work here or something," Lydia replied, grateful for the familiar rhythm of banter to calm her nerves. "Strange coincidence." His eyes sparkled with mischief. "I was just telling my associates about this amazing diner I'd discovered. Great coffee, excellent atmosphere, and the most memorable service in the city." "Memorable?" "The waitress there saved me from the most boring evening of my life. Very dramatic rescue involving a fake family emergency." Despite herself, Lydia smiled. "Sounds like quite a story." It was. Though I have to say the follow-up has been disappointing. 3 days, and not even a phone call to check on her poor brother's well-being. Maybe she's been busy working double shifts to pay rent. Maybe her brother should have offered to help with that. The suggestion hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Lydia's stomach flutter with equal parts excitement and alarm. This was how it started, the slow slide into dependence that ended with women like her becoming decorative accessories for men like him. "I can handle my own rent," she said firmly, though not unkindly. "I'm sure you can. Just like you handled that crypto enthusiast the other night." Brad wasn't exactly a challenging opponent. Still, it was impressively executed. "Which brings me to my real question." Julian stepped closer, lowering his voice until she had to lean in to hear him. "How would you feel about a repeat performance? Another rescue mission? More of a extended engagement? I have a charity gala next weekend. Very fancy, very boring, crawling with women who think a conversation about trust funds constitutes foreplay." Lydia stared at him. "You want me to pretend to be your sister at a charity event?" "Actually, I was thinking more along the lines of girlfriend. Sister worked well for the diner emergency, but it might raise questions at a black tie event." The word girlfriend sent heat through her chest, even though she knew it was just another performance. "Why me? Surely you know plenty of women who would love to be your arm candy for an evening." "Arm candy?" Julian's eyebrows rose. "Is that what you think this is about?" "Isn't it?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Around them, the diner continued its familiar rhythm, the clink of silverware, the murmur of conversation, the hiss of the grill. But Lydia felt like they were alone in a bubble of tension. "The women I usually date," he said finally, They see me as a prize to be won, a status symbol. They laugh at jokes that aren't funny, and agree with opinions they don't share, because they think that's what I want to hear. And you think I'm different? I think you're the only person who's ever called me brother in public and made it sound like a threat. His smile was rueful. You don't want anything from me, Lydia. That makes you either the most refreshing woman I've met in years or completely insane. Why not both? Julian laughed, a sound that drew curious glances from his business associates. See, that's exactly what I'm talking about. When's the last time someone surprised you? About 4 minutes ago, when 3 men in suits that cost more than my car walked into a diner that serves pie from 1987. The pie's from 1987? Gordon refuses to change the recipe, says it's perfect the way it is. Smart man, some things shouldn't be improved upon. The way he was looking at her made Lydia's pulse skip. This was dangerous territory, the kind of flirtation that could make a practical woman forget about the vast differences in their circumstances. I don't know anything about charity events, she said, trying to inject some reality into the conversation. I don't own a dress that costs more than $50, and I get nervous at fancy restaurants. Your friends would see right through me. My friends, Julian said with a hint of steel in his voice, spend most of their time trying to impress people they don't like with money they inherited from people they barely remember. Trust me, authenticity will be a refreshing change. And after the gala? What happens when this little experiment is over? Julian's expression grew serious. Then we go back to our respective worlds, and you'll have helped me avoid 3 hours of aggressive networking disguised as small talk. It should have been reassuring, the clear boundaries, the understood limitations. Instead, Lydia felt a strange pang of disappointment that he was already planning their ending. I don't know, she said, though part of her was already imagining what it would feel like to spend an evening in Julian's world. This seems like a bad idea for about 15 different reasons. Name 3. We barely know each other. I don't belong in your social circle. And fake relationships never end well in romantic comedies. This isn't a romantic comedy, Julian pointed out, though his eyes held a glimmer. This is 2 adults helping each other solve a problem. Order up, Gordon called from the kitchen, breaking the spell that had woven itself around them. Lydia grabbed the plates mechanically, her mind spinning with possibilities. When she returned from delivering the food, Julian was back at his table, but his attention remained fixed on her. Every time she glanced in his direction, he was watching her with that same intensity that made her feel like the only person in the room. As the 3 men prepared to leave, Julian lingered while his associates headed for the door. He pulled out his wallet and left a tip that made Lydia's eyes widen. More than she typically made in an entire shift. That's too much, she protested. It's exactly right for exceptional service. He paused at the counter, close enough that she could smell his cologne again. The event is Saturday at 7. I could pick you up at 6. I didn't say yes. You didn't say no either. Julian, think about it, he said softly. One evening, good cause, decent food, and I promise to be the perfect fake boyfriend. And if I say no, then I'll respect your decision and find another way to avoid the matrimonial ambitions of the city's social elite. He started to turn away, then stopped. Oh, and Lydia? Whatever you decide, this was worth the detour. She watched him walk away, admiring the confident set of his shoulders, and the way other diners tracked his movement with curious eyes. At the door, he turned back one last time, that slow smile spreading across his face as their eyes met. After he left, the diner felt smaller somehow, as if his presence had expanded the space and his absence had contracted it again. Marge appeared at her elbow, eyes bright with curiosity. That boy's got it bad, she observed. It's not like that, Lydia protested, though her cheeks were heating again. "It's just business." "Honey, I've been watching men chase women since before you were born. That wasn't business. That was a man who'd walk through fire to see you smile." Lydia spent the rest of her shift replaying the conversation, weighing pros and cons while she refilled coffee cups and cleared tables. The practical part of her mind catalogued all the ways this could go wrong. The social minefield of his world, the inevitable end when novelty wore off, the danger of getting too attached to something that was never meant to be real. But underneath the practical concerns, excitement hummed like electricity. When was the last time she'd done something purely for the adventure of it? When had she last felt this alive, this desired, this interesting? That evening, she sat in her tiny apartment, with Julian's business card in one hand and her phone in the other, trying to decide if she was brave enough to step into his world for one night. Outside her window, the city glittered with 1,000 different possibilities, and for the first time in months, Lydia felt like she might be ready to reach for one of them. By Thursday evening, Lydia had changed her mind approximately 47 times. She drafted and deleted 12 different text messages, practiced saying no in her bathroom mirror, and even gone so far as to research how to survive fancy charity events on the internet. But when she finally called Julian's number, the word that came out of her mouth was yes. "I was beginning to think you'd decided I was too dangerous," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "I still think you're dangerous. I've just decided I don't care." Careful, Lydia. Comments like that could give a man ideas. The flirtation in his tone sent warmth spiraling through her chest. "What time should I be ready?" 6:30. "I'll pick you up." "You don't know where I live." "Text me the address." "And Lydia, don't overthink this, it's just one evening." But as Saturday approached, Lydia discovered that, just one evening, required considerably more preparation than she'd anticipated. The first crisis came when she realized that her entire wardrobe consisted of work uniforms, yoga pants, and exactly 3 dresses, none of which seemed appropriate for a charity gala. "You need to borrow something," her roommate Stella declared, surveying the clothing disaster that had exploded across Lydia's bed. "My cousin Emma works for a catering company that does high-end events. She's got connections." Which was how Lydia found herself standing in a boutique that seemed to specialize in items with price tags that made her break out in a cold sweat, trying on a midnight blue gown that probably cost more than her rent. "It's perfect," Emma announced, stepping back to admire the effect. "Classic enough to fit in, stunning enough to be memorable." "It's too much," Lydia protested, though she had to admit the dress was beautiful. The silk felt like liquid against her skin, and the cut was both elegant and flattering in ways that made her look like a completely different person. "Trust me," Emma said firmly, "in his world, underdressed is worse than overdressed. This dress says you belong there, even if you don't feel like you do." Saturday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth, and Lydia's nerves stretched tight as violin strings. She'd spent an hour on her hair, another 30 minutes on makeup, and at least 20 minutes staring at herself in the mirror, trying to recognize the woman looking back at her. The dress transformed her. Gone was the tired waitress in coffee-stained uniforms. In her place stood someone who looked like she could hold her own in any ballroom. The midnight blue brought out the warmth in her dark eyes, and Emma had been right about the cut. It suggested sophistication without screaming desperation. At exactly 6:30, her phone buzzed with a text, "Downstairs when you're ready." Lydia grabbed her borrowed purse, a tiny thing that barely held her phone and lip gloss, and made her way down to the street. The elevator in her building was broken again, so she had to take the stairs in heels that were higher than anything she'd ever worn. Julian was waiting beside a sleek black car that looked like it belonged in a movie about international espionage. He was leaning against the passenger door, scrolling through his phone, and when he looked up and saw her, his expression shifted into something that made her breath catch. "Wow," he said softly, straightening to his full height. Tonight he wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean lines of his frame. "You look ridiculous," Lydia supplied, suddenly self-conscious. "Like I'm playing dress-up." "Stunning," Julian corrected, moving to open the car door for her. "You look absolutely stunning." As she slid into the car, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. A woman who looked like she belonged in Julian's world, at least on the surface. If only she could convince her racing heart to slow down and her hands to stop trembling. "Nervous?" Julian asked as he settled into the driver's seat. "Terrified," Lydia admitted. "What if someone asks me questions I can't answer? What if I use the wrong fork or say something inappropriate?" Julian reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. The gesture was meant to be comforting, but it made her feel something else. "First rule of high society events," he said, "most people are too busy worrying about their own performance to pay close attention to yours. Second rule, when in doubt, ask questions. People love talking about themselves. And the third rule," his smile was wickedly charming, "stay close to me. I'll make sure you have backup if conversation gets too treacherous." The venue was a historic mansion that had been converted into an event space, all marble columns and crystal chandeliers that sparkled like captured starlight. Valets in white gloves whisked cars away, while guests streamed up the wide steps in a parade of designer gowns and expensive jewelry. "This is insane," Lydia breathed as Julian helped her from the car. "Look at this place. It's like something from a fairy tale." "Wait until you see the inside," Julian said, offering her his arm. The original owner had very expensive taste and no sense of restraint. He was right. The ballroom was a study in gilded excess. Soaring ceilings decorated with frescoes, enormous mirrors that reflected the light from dozens of chandeliers, and enough flowers to stock a small florist shop. The guests were equally impressive. A sea of designer labels and carefully cultivated beauty that made Lydia feel like an imposter, despite her borrowed finery. "Breathe," Julian murmured in her ear as they paused at the entrance. "You belong here tonight." "Julian!" A woman in a red dress approached them with the kind of predatory smile that suggested she viewed other women as competition. "I was hoping you'd be here tonight. And who is this lovely creature?" "Vivian." Julian's arm tightened almost imperceptibly around Lydia's waist. "I'd like you to meet Lydia Cullen." "Lydia, this is Vivian Ashworth. Her family sponsors half the cultural events in the city." "How wonderful," Vivian said, though her eyes were already cataloguing Lydia's dress, shoes and jewelry, with the precision of an appraiser. "And what brings you into Julian's orbit, dear?" The question was a loaded one, designed to establish territory and hierarchy. Lydia felt Julian tense beside her, but before he could intervene, she found her voice. "Actually, Julian rescued me from a terrible blind date," she said with a smile that was all sweetness and sharp edges. "My date spent 20 minutes explaining why women can't understand cryptocurrency. Julian was kind enough to pretend to be my brother so I could escape." Vivian's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose slightly. "How creative." "I thought so," Lydia agreed cheerfully, "though I have to say, Julian makes a terrible brother. Much too handsome for the role to be believable." Julian's surprised laughter drew several curious glances. "She has a point. I've never been particularly good at the protective sibling act." "No," Vivian said, her smile growing more strained by the moment. "I imagine you excel at other roles entirely." The barbed comment hung in the air, but before the conversation could grow more uncomfortable, a silver-haired man in an impeccable tuxedo appeared at Julian's shoulder. "Cross! There you are. I've been looking everywhere for you." The newcomer's eyes crinkled with genuine warmth as he looked between Julian and Lydia. "And you must be the mysterious companion I've been hearing whispers about." "Lydia, meet Harrison Montgomery," Julian said, and Lydia immediately recognized the name from newspaper business sections. "Harry, this is Lydia Cullen." "Delighted," Harry said, taking her hand with old-fashioned gallantry. "Julian's been uncharacteristically secretive about his personal life lately. Now I understand why he wanted to keep you all to himself." "Can you blame me?" Julian's arm tightened around Lydia's waist, a gesture that felt more possessive than protective. "Some treasures are worth guarding." Lydia's cheeks flushed at the words, even though she knew it was part of their performance. But the look in Julian's eyes when he said it suggested the line between fiction and reality was blurring in dangerous ways. "Well, I hate to interrupt," Vivian said with a smile that could have cut glass, "but I promised the Hendersons I'd introduce them to Julian. Business before pleasure, you know." "Actually," Harry interjected smoothly, "I was hoping to steal Lydia away for a dance. If Julian can spare her, of course." Lydia felt panic flutter in her chest. Dancing with Harry Montgomery while Julian conducted business was not part of their arrangement, but before she could protest, Julian was nodding. "Of course," he said, though his eyes held a warning that was clearly meant for Harry. "I'll find you in a few minutes." Harry led her onto the dance floor with the confidence of a man who'd been attending such events since childhood. He was a graceful dancer, and Lydia found herself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of a waltz. "So," Harry said as they moved across the polished marble floor, "how long have you been seeing Julian?" "Not long," Lydia replied carefully. "We're still figuring things out." "Smart approach. Julian's not the kind of man who does anything halfway." Harry's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Though I have to say, I've never seen him quite so attentive. Usually he treats these events like necessary evils to be endured." "And tonight?" "Tonight he hasn't taken his eyes off you since you walked in." Even while Vivian was monopolizing the conversation, his attention was entirely focused on you. Harry spun her expertly around a slower couple. "That's either very good acting or something considerably more interesting." Before Lydia could respond, she felt a familiar warmth at her back. Julian's voice was low and amused as he cut in. "Mind if I reclaim my date, Harry?" "She's all yours," Harry said with a knowing smile. "Though I warn you, she's far too charming to keep hidden away." As Julian's arms came around her, Lydia felt the world narrow to just the two of them. He was an even better dancer than Harry, leading her through the steps with an effortless confidence that made her feel graceful and light. "Having fun?" he asked, his voice pitched low enough that she had to lean closer to hear him. "More than I expected," she admitted. "Your friends are interesting." "That's a diplomatic way of putting it. What did you think of Vivian?" "She seems nice," Lydia lied, then caught Julian's skeptical expression. "Okay, fine. She looks like she'd push her own grandmother down the stairs if it meant getting closer to you." Julian's laughter was rich and delighted. "Vivian's been trying to convince me to marry her for 3 years. She's under the impression that determination will eventually wear down my resistance." "And will it? What do you think?" The question was loaded with implications that made Lydia's pulse skip. This close, she could see flecks of silver in his gray eyes, and the fine lines that suggested he smiled more often than his serious reputation suggested. "I think," she said carefully, "that you're not the type of man who can be convinced of anything unless you want to be." Perceptive, his hand slid lower on her back, pulling her closer until they were dancing scandalously close for such a formal event. "Tell me something, Lydia. Are you enjoying yourself, or are you counting the minutes until you can go home and pretend this never happened?" The honest answer surprised her. "I'm enjoying myself." Which is terrifying because this isn't real life. This is like being Cinderella at the ball, except I know exactly when the carriage turns back into a pumpkin. "And when is that?" "When you realize I'm just a waitress who writes bad poetry on napkins and lives in a studio apartment with a broken air conditioner." Julian stopped dancing, his hands coming up to frame her face with gentle fingers. Around them, other couples continued their elegant waltz, but Lydia felt like they were alone in a bubble of tension. "First," he said, his voice serious, despite the music and laughter surrounding them, "you're not just anything. You're intelligent, funny, brave enough to throw yourself at strangers when you need rescuing, and honest enough to call me out when I'm being ridiculous. Julian. Second," he continued, ignoring her protest, "I've read your poetry." Lydia's heart stopped. "What?" "The napkin you gave me that night at the gala. I kept it." His thumb traced across her cheekbone, a touch so gentle it made her breath catch. "It was beautiful, Lydia. Raw and honest, and more moving than anything I've read in years. It was just something I scribbled during my break. It was art, and the woman who wrote it is worth a dozen Vivians, trust funds and social connections included." The words stole her breath and made her heart race in ways that had nothing to do with their dancing. This was dangerous territory. The kind of territory where fake relationships became real feelings and practical women forgot about protecting themselves. "You don't know me," she whispered. "I know enough." His voice was low and rough, full of promises that made her shiver. "I know you taste like coffee. I know you're brave enough to take risks but smart enough to be scared. And I know that everything about tonight feels more real than anything I've experienced in years." Before she could respond, before she could process the implications of what he was saying, the moment was shattered by a voice that cut through the music like a blade. "Well, well, if it isn't Julian Cross and his latest acquisition." They turned to find a woman approaching them. She was beautiful in the way of expensive things, perfectly styled, flawlessly made up, and radiating the kind of cold confidence that came from never having to worry about rent or groceries or whether you belong somewhere. "Catherine," Julian said, and Lydia heard the tension that entered his voice. "I didn't know you were back in the city. Just flew in from the Hamptons. Daddy's yacht needed some maintenance work." Catherine's smile was sharp as her attention shifted to Lydia. "And you must be the mysterious woman everyone's been whispering about." "I'm Catherine Blackwood. Julian and I have quite a bit of history." The words were innocent enough, but they carried an undercurrent of ownership that made Lydia's stomach clench. This was Julian's ex, she realized, someone from his world who knew all the rules and spoke the language fluently. "Lydia Cullen," she replied, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "Charming," Catherine said, though her eyes suggested she found Lydia anything but. "Tell me, dear, what do you do?" It was the same question Vivian had asked, but this time it felt like an attack. Catherine already knew the answer. Lydia could see it in the malicious gleam in her eyes. "I'm a writer," Lydia said, lifting her chin with defiance she didn't entirely feel. "How wonderful. What do you write? Novels? Articles?" Catherine's smile widened. "Please tell me you're not one of those people who thinks blogging makes them a journalist." "Actually," a new voice interjected smoothly, "Lydia's working on something quite extraordinary, a collection of urban poetry that's both gritty and beautiful." Lydia turned to find Harry Montgomery at her elbow, his expression friendly, but his eyes sharp with understanding. He'd obviously overheard enough of the conversation to recognize a rescue mission when one was needed. "Poetry," Catherine repeated with barely concealed disdain. "How artistic." "The best art usually is," Julian said coolly, his arm tightening around Lydia's waist. "If you'll excuse us, Catherine, I promised Lydia some air." Without waiting for a response, he guided Lydia through the crowd toward a set of French doors that led to a terrace overlooking the mansion's gardens. The cool evening air was a relief after the heated atmosphere of the ballroom, and Lydia found herself breathing deeply for the first time in minutes. "I'm sorry about that," Julian said, once they were alone on the terrace. "Catherine has a talent for making situations uncomfortable." "Ex-girlfriend?" Lydia asked, though she already knew the answer. Ex-fiancé actually. We ended things about 2 years ago. The word, fiancé, hit Lydia like a punch to the stomach. Of course, Julian had been engaged before, probably to someone exactly like Catherine, someone who belonged in his world and understood its rules. She's beautiful, Lydia said quietly. She's cold, Julian replied without hesitation. Beautiful on the surface, maybe, but there's nothing warm or genuine underneath. Everything about Catherine is calculated. Her clothes, her conversation, her relationships. She saw me as a merger opportunity, not a partner. And that's not what you want. Julian was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the moonlight that filtered through the garden's trees. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. What I want, he said, is someone who looks at me and sees Julian, not Julian Cross of Cross Holdings. Someone who argues with me when I'm wrong, who isn't impressed by expensive restaurants and designer suits, who writes poetry on napkins, because the words come to her in the middle of a busy shift. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. This was no longer about fake relationships and charity events. This was real, raw, dangerous territory, where hearts could get broken and fairy tales crumbled under the weight of reality. Julian, Lydia began, but before she could voice all the practical reasons why this was impossible, why their worlds were too different, why she couldn't afford to believe in fairy tales, he stepped closer. I know what you're going to say, he said, his hands coming up to frame her face again. All the logical reasons why this can't work, the differences in our backgrounds, our social circles, our bank accounts. Those differences matter. Do they? Right now, in this moment, do they really matter? Before she could answer, before she could summon all the practical objections that had kept her safe for years, Julian was kissing her. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if he was giving her time to pull away. But when her hands fisted in his shirt and she melted against him, the kiss deepened into something that made her forget about everything but the taste of him, and the way he made her feel like she was floating. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lydia felt like the world had shifted on its axis. This was no longer about one evening of playing pretend. This was about feelings that were spinning rapidly out of control. That felt real, Julian said quietly, his forehead resting against hers. Too real, Lydia whispered, and she could hear the fear in her own voice. Before Julian could respond, the sound of voices from the ballroom reminded them that they weren't alone in the world. Reality crashed back the party, the expectations, the vast differences in their lives that couldn't be erased by moonlight and kisses. We should go back inside, Lydia said, though every part of her wanted to stay in this moment forever. Should we? People will talk. Let them. But even as he said it, Julian stepped back, giving her space to breathe and think. The spell was broken, and Lydia felt the weight of their situation again. They returned to the ballroom together, but something had changed. The easy playfulness of their earlier interaction had been replaced by an awareness that made every accidental touch feel electric. Lydia found herself hyper-conscious of Julian's presence beside her, the way his hand settled on her back when he introduced her to someone new, the way his attention never seemed to wander far from her face. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations and dancing, but underneath it all was the memory of that kiss, and the promise it represented. By the time Julian was driving her home, the car filled with a tension that had nothing to do with their fake relationship, and everything to do with feelings that were becoming impossible to ignore. Thank you, Lydia said as they pulled up to her building. For tonight, I mean. It was incredible. The evening's not over yet, Julian pointed out, but he made no move to get out of the car. Isn't it? That depends on what you want it to be. The question hung between them. Lydia looked up at her building. The broken elevator, the cramped studio apartment, the reality of her life that felt 1,000,000 miles away from crystal chandeliers and designer gowns. I should go, she said finally, though she wanted to stay. Should, Julian repeated with a small smile. That seems to be your favorite word tonight. It's a practical word. So is want. What do you want, Lydia? The honest answer would have terrified them both. Instead, she reached for the door handle, already mourning the loss of this magical evening. I want to remember tonight exactly like this, she said. Perfect and impossible and completely outside of real life. Julian's expression grew serious. And tomorrow? Tomorrow I go back to being a waitress, and you go back to being a millionaire, and we pretend this never happened. Is that what you really want? Lydia's hand stilled on the door handle. The smart answer, the safe answer, was yes. But looking at Julian's face in the dim light of the car, seeing something that might have been hope or heartbreak in his eyes, she found she couldn't lie. No, she whispered. But it's what makes sense. She was out of the car and halfway to her building before Julian could respond, her borrowed heels clicking against the sidewalk like a countdown to midnight. At the door, she turned back to see him still sitting in the car, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment, Lydia was strongly drawn to the possibility. Then she forced herself to turn away, to walk into her building and back to her real life, even though every step felt like walking away from a piece of her heart. Lydia had been back in her real life for exactly 6 days, and she was beginning to think she'd imagined the entire evening. The midnight blue dress hung in her closet like evidence of a fever dream, and every time she caught sight of it, her heart did something acrobatic that had nothing to do with caffeine consumption. She'd returned Emma's borrowed accessories, gone back to her double shifts at Mel's diner, and tried to pretend that Julian Cross was just a beautiful memory. The problem was that beautiful memories weren't supposed to leave business cards burning holes in your pocket, or make you check your phone every 5 minutes, hoping for a text that never came. You're distracted, Gordon observed on Thursday morning as she poured salt into a customer's coffee cup instead of sugar. Been distracted all week. That fancy boy do something to upset you? What fancy boy? Lydia asked, though her cheeks were already heating. The one in the expensive suit who's been staring at you through the window for the past 10 minutes. Lydia's head snapped up so fast, she nearly gave herself whiplash. Sure enough, Julian was standing on the sidewalk outside the diner, hands in his pockets, watching her through the glass with an expression that made her pulse skip. Today he wasn't wearing a tuxedo, or even one of his perfectly tailored business suits. Instead, he wore dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt that somehow made him look more approachable and infinitely more dangerous to her peace of mind. Oh, she breathed, her hands suddenly unsteady on the coffee pot. All is right, Gordon said with amusement. Better go see what he wants before he wears a hole in the sidewalk. Lydia set down the coffee pot and walked toward the door on legs that felt distinctly unreliable. Julian's eyes tracked her movement, and when she stepped outside into the morning sunshine, his slow smile made her forget how to breathe properly. Hi, she said, proud of how normal her voice sounded. Hi yourself. Julian's gaze swept over her uniform, the same coffee-stained apron and sensible shoes that marked her as firmly middle class. You look good. I look like a waitress. You look like yourself. I've missed that. The simple honesty in his voice nearly undid her. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of, the way he could make her forget about practical concerns with just a few words. What are you doing here, Julian? I was in the neighborhood. At her skeptical look, he smiled. Okay, that's a lie. I was going crazy not talking to you. We agreed. You decided, he corrected gently. I never agreed to anything. Before Lydia could respond, the diner door opened behind her, and several customers emerged, their curious gazes taking in the well-dressed man who was clearly not from the neighborhood. Can we talk? Julian asked. Somewhere more private. Lydia glanced back at the diner, where Gordon was probably watching through the window with undisguised interest. My break isn't for another hour. I'll wait. Julian, you can't just… I can wait in the car, he said reasonably. Or I can sit at the counter and order coffee every 15 minutes until your shift ends. Your choice. The determination in his voice told her he wasn't bluffing, and the last thing she needed was Julian Cross conducting a siege of Mel's diner while she tried to work. 1 hour, she said finally. Then we talk. His smile was brilliant with victory. I'll be right here. Lydia made it through the next hour by sheer force of will, though she was acutely aware of Julian's presence in the diner. He'd chosen a corner booth and was working on his laptop, nursing a single cup of coffee and politely deflecting Gordon's attempts at conversation. When her break finally came, she untied her apron with hands that were definitely trembling and slid into the booth across from him. Okay, she said without preamble. Talk. Julian closed his laptop and leaned back, studying her face with that intensity that made her feel exposed. I haven't been able to stop thinking about Saturday night. Julian, let me finish. His voice was quiet but firm. I know what you said about going back to our separate worlds. I know all the logical reasons why this doesn't make sense. But logic doesn't explain why I've spent the past 6 days replaying every conversation we've had. It was one evening, Lydia said desperately. One perfect, impossible evening that we both knew had an expiration date. Did we? Because I remember you kissing me back like it meant something. Of course it meant something. That's the problem. How is that a problem? Because you're you and I'm me, and fairy tales don't happen to waitresses from Queens. Her voice had risen enough to draw curious glances from other diners. Julian reached across the table and covered her hand with his. What if they do? He asked softly. What if we stop overthinking this and see where it leads? Where it leads is me getting my heart broken when you realize that I don't fit in your world. What makes you so sure you don't fit? Lydia stared at him in disbelief. Did you miss the part where your ex-fiancé made me feel like something she'd scrape off her shoe? Or where every person at that gala looked at me like they were trying to figure out what I was doing there? Catherine's opinion stopped mattering to me 2 years ago. And everyone else? Julian shrugged. Half of them are trust fund babies, who've never worked a day in their lives. The other half are social climbers who married into money. Why do you care what they think? Because they're your people. No, Julian said firmly, his grip on her hand tightening. They're not. They're people I do business with, people I grew up around, people who happen to move in the same circles. But they're not my friends, and they're certainly not my family. Then who is? Julian was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing patterns across her knuckles. I don't have much in the way of family. My parents died when I was in college, and I never had siblings. As for friends, it's hard to know who likes Julian and who likes Julian Cross's bank account. The loneliness in his voice made her heart clench. That must be difficult. It was, until I met a waitress who called me her brother in public. Despite everything, Lydia felt her lips curve into a small smile. That was a desperate moment. It was perfect. You were perfect. Julian's voice dropped to that whiskey-smooth tone that made her shiver. You still are? I'm not perfect, Julian. I'm broke, I'm struggling, and I have absolutely nothing to offer someone like you. You have everything to offer, he said intently. You're real, Lydia. In a world full of people playing roles and wearing masks, you're completely, genuinely, yourself. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it absently, then felt her blood run cold. Saw the pictures from the Montgomery Gala. Interesting date choice for Cross. Call me. Rebecca Walsh, City Style Magazine. What is it? Julian asked, obviously noticing her expression. With numb fingers, Lydia opened her browser and searched for her name. The results made her stomach drop through the floor. Mystery woman steals hearts at Montgomery charity gala. Who is Lydia Cullen? Inside Julian Cross's surprising romance, from waitress to princess. The Cinderella story that has everyone talking. Each headline was accompanied by photos from Saturday night. Julian's hand on her back, the two of them dancing, the moment on the terrace that had felt so private and perfect. In the harsh light of media scrutiny, their fairy tale looked exactly like what Catherine Blackwood had called it, an acquisition. "Oh God," she breathed, scrolling through article after article. "Oh God, Julian, look at this." Julian took her phone, his expression growing darker with each headline. "Lydia, I'm sorry, I had no idea." "Listen to this," she said, her voice shaking as she read from one of the articles. Sources close to Cross suggest that his relationship with Cullen is a calculated move to improve his public image after last year's corporate merger controversy. The timing is certainly convenient, as Cross Holdings prepares to launch their affordable housing initiative. "That's complete garbage," Julian said firmly. "You know that's not, do I?" Lydia looked up at him, and he saw something breaking in her eyes. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like I played right into whatever game you're playing." "This isn't a game." "Isn't it? Think about it from my perspective, Julian. Rich businessman takes working-class woman to high society event, right before launching a project that benefits working-class people. It looks exactly like a PR stunt. You can't seriously believe that." But even as he said it, Julian could see that she did believe it, or at least part of her did. The doubt was there in her eyes, mixed with hurt and humiliation that made his chest tighten with rage at the vultures who called themselves journalists. "I need to go," Lydia said, standing abruptly. "My break's over." "Lydia, wait." "No." She held up a hand to stop him. "I can't do this, Julian. I can't be your project or your publicity stunt or whatever this is supposed to be. It's not. Prove it." The words came out like a challenge, sharp and desperate. "If this is real, if I'm more than just some interesting distraction, prove it." Julian stared at her, his mind racing. "How did you prove something like love? How did you demonstrate that your feelings were genuine when the entire world was convinced they were calculated?" Before he could find an answer, Lydia was walking away, her shoulders rigid with hurt and determination. Julian watched her go, feeling like she was taking something vital with her. The rest of Lydia's shift passed in a blur of whispered conversations and curious stares. Word had spread quickly. One of the other waitresses had seen the articles, and soon everyone at Mel's knew that their Lydia had been photographed at a fancy charity gala with one of the city's most eligible bachelors. "Is it true?" Stella asked when she called during Lydia's dinner break. "Are you really dating Julian Cross?" "No," Lydia said firmly. "It was one date. One fake date that somehow turned into a media circus. The pictures don't look fake. The pictures lie." But even as she said it, Lydia remembered the way Julian had looked at her on that terrace, the way he'd kissed her like she was precious and rare. Had that been fake too? Was she really so naive that she couldn't tell the difference between genuine attraction and calculated performance? By the time she finally made it home that evening, Lydia felt wrung out and hollow. Her phone had been buzzing all day with calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Reporters, she assumed, looking for quotes about her relationship with Julian Cross. She was fumbling with her keys when a familiar voice made her freeze. "Rough day?" Julian was leaning against the wall beside her apartment door, still in the casual clothes from that morning but looking significantly more tired. His hair was disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and there were lines of stress around his eyes. "What are you doing here?" she asked wearily. "Waiting for you. We need to finish our conversation." "I thought we did finish it." "You walked away before I could answer your challenge." Lydia's hands stilled on her keys. "What challenge?" "You asked me to prove that this is real." Julian straightened, moving closer until she could smell his cologne again. "So I'm here to prove it." Julian. I spent the afternoon with my lawyers, he said quietly, and my publicist. Do you know what they told me? Lydia shook her head, suddenly afraid to hear the answer. They told me that the smartest thing I could do right now is distance myself from you. Put out a statement saying we're friends, that Saturday night was a misunderstanding, that there's nothing romantic between us. And you're here to tell me you're taking their advice? I'm here to tell you that I fired my publicist. Lydia's breath caught. What? I told her that if she couldn't figure out how to handle a simple relationship announcement, then she wasn't worth the money I was paying her. Julian's smile was rueful. My lawyers think I've lost my mind. Have you? Probably. He stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. But if I have, it's your fault. You and your poetry and your terrible taste in blind dates and the way you look at me like I'm just Julian instead of Julian Cross. The media attention will die down eventually, it always does. Your reputation will survive. It's survived worse scandals than dating a beautiful woman who happens to work for a living. Julian, you're not thinking clearly. This could hurt your business, your social standing. Lydia. His hands came up to frame her face, the gesture achingly familiar from that night on the terrace. I don't care. You have to care. This is your life we're talking about. Exactly, my life. And I want you in it. The words hung between them, heavy with implication and promise. This was the moment of truth. The place where fairy tales either came true or shattered against the rocks of reality. I'm scared, Lydia whispered. So am I, Julian admitted. Terrified, actually. I've never felt this way about anyone before. What if it doesn't work? What if we're too different? Then we'll figure it out together. But Lydia, we have to try. This thing between us, it's too real, too important to throw away, because of what other people might think. Looking into his eyes, seeing the sincerity and hope and yes, fear that matched her own, Lydia felt her defenses crumbling. Maybe fairy tales could happen to waitresses from Queens. Maybe love was worth the risk of heartbreak. Maybe, just maybe, Julian Cross was worth believing in. Okay, she said softly. Okay, let's try. Let's see what happens when we stop overthinking and just be. Julian's smile was brilliant with relief and joy. Are you sure? No. Lydia laughed, feeling lighter than she had all week. I'm absolutely terrified, but I'm sure about you. This time, when Julian kissed her, there was nothing tentative about it. This was a claiming, a promise, a declaration that they were choosing each other, despite all the practical reasons why it couldn't work. And for the first time since Saturday night, Lydia allowed herself to believe that maybe, sometimes, fairy tales came true. The next morning brought a new wave of media attention that made the previous day's coverage look restrained. Lydia's phone started buzzing at 6 a.m. with calls from reporters who'd somehow gotten her number, and by the time she made it to work, there were photographers camped outside Mel's diner. This is insane, she muttered to Gordon as she tied on her apron, trying to ignore the flashes going off every time someone passed the windows. This is good for business, Gordon countered, gesturing toward the packed dining room. Haven't seen this place this busy since the food critic from the Times got food poisoning from our meatloaf. He was right. Every table was full, and the line of people waiting for seats stretched out the door. But Lydia quickly realized that most of the customers weren't there for the food. They were there to gawk at the mystery waitress who'd captured Julian Cross's attention. Excuse me, a woman in an expensive handbag asked as Lydia delivered her coffee, but are you really dating that millionaire, the one from the pictures? I'm just here to work, Lydia replied diplomatically, though she could feel heat rising in her cheeks. But the photos looked so romantic. How did you meet? What's he really like? Before Lydia could answer, another customer called out, Hey, when's the wedding? Can we get an exclusive? The questions kept coming throughout the morning shift, each one making Lydia feel more exposed and uncomfortable. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of, being reduced to a curiosity, a sideshow for people's entertainment. By lunchtime, she was ready to quit her job and move to Montana when Julian walked through the door. The entire diner fell silent. Cameras flashed outside as photographers caught sight of him, and every customer turned to stare as he made his way toward the counter. Today he was back in one of his tailored suits, looking every inch the successful businessman despite the circus outside. "Hi," he said quietly when he reached her station. "Hi yourself." Lydia was aware of every eye in the place focused on them. "You know there are reporters outside, right?" "I noticed. They followed me here from my office." "And you came anyway?" Julian's smile was soft and private, meant just for her. "I told you yesterday that I don't care what people think. I meant it." Around them, conversations had resumed, but Lydia could feel the weight of attention. Someone was probably recording their interaction right now, ready to dissect every word and gesture for hidden meaning. "What can I get you?" she asked, falling back on professional routine. "Coffee," Julian said. "And 5 minutes of your time when you have a break." "I don't know when that'll be." "As you can see, we're busy." Julian glanced around the packed diner, taking in the curious stares and barely concealed excitement. "Because of me." "Because of us," Lydia corrected. "This is what I was trying to tell you yesterday. Everything changes now." Before Julian could respond, Gordon appeared beside them with a pot of fresh coffee and a knowing look. "Why don't you take your break now, girl? I can handle things for a few minutes." "Gordon, I can't just break now." His tone brooked no argument. "And take the back exit if you want some privacy." Lydia untied her apron, grateful for Gordon's intervention despite her embarrassment. She led Julian through the kitchen to the small alley behind the diner, where the air smelled of garbage and grease, but at least they were away from prying eyes. "I'm sorry about this," Julian said as soon as they were alone. "I should have anticipated the media attention." "Should have, could have, would have." Lydia sighed, leaning against the brick wall. "It doesn't matter now, the damage is done." "What damage?" "Look around, Julian. I can't even do my job without people treating me like a zoo exhibit. Every customer wants to know about our relationship, every conversation gets analyzed for hidden meaning. This isn't living, it's performing." Julian stepped closer, his expression serious. "It'll calm down. Media attention always does." "Will it?" "Because I've been getting calls all morning from reporters wanting to know about my rags to riches romance. One woman offered me $50,000 for an exclusive interview about what it's like to date you." "50,000?" Julian's eyebrows rose. "You could quit the diner. Focus on your writing. I'm not selling our private life for money." Lydia's voice was sharp with indignation. "That's exactly the kind of thing that would make everyone think this whole thing is fake." "Then what do you want to do?" It was a simple question, but Lydia found she didn't have a simple answer. What she wanted was for them to exist in a bubble where their different worlds didn't matter, where they could get to know each other without the weight of public scrutiny and social expectations. "I want to go back to Saturday night," she said finally. "Before the photographers and the headlines and the speculation. I want to dance with you again and pretend like the rest of the world doesn't exist." Julian's expression softened. "We can't go backward." "I know. But Julian, I don't know how to go forward either. Every time we're together in public it becomes a performance. People expect us to be this perfect fairy tale couple, and I don't know how to be that." "You don't have to be anything other than yourself." "But what if myself isn't enough?" The question hung between them in the humid air of the alley. Julian was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with that intensity that always made her feel exposed and cherished at the same time. "Can I show you something?" he asked finally. Without waiting for an answer, he reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out a small, carefully folded piece of paper. Lydia recognized it immediately. The napkin she'd given him at the charity event, the one with her hastily scribbled poem. "You kept it," she breathed. "I've read it probably 100 times." Julian unfolded the napkin carefully, as if it were made of precious metal instead of cheap paper. "Do you want to know why?" Lydia nodded, not trusting her voice. "Because it's real," he said simply. "In a world where everything is filtered and polished and calculated, you wrote something raw and honest on a diner napkin. And it's beautiful, Lydia. More beautiful than anything I've seen in any gallery, or read in any book." He held the napkin out so she could see her own handwriting, the words she'd written during a break between the dinner rush and closing. "In the space between heartbeats, between coffee refills and borrowed dreams, I catch glimpses of who I could be, if I were brave enough to reach for stars that shine in borrowed light." "It was just something I scribbled," Lydia protested, though her throat was tight with emotion. "Nothing special. It was everything special. And the woman who wrote it, tired, underpaid, dreaming bigger dreams than her circumstances should allow, she's the one I fell for. Not some polished version, not some society princess. You." Tears pricked at Lydia's eyes. "Julian, I know you're scared. I know this world seems impossible to navigate. But Lydia, you belong wherever you choose to be. And I choose to be wherever you are." Before she could respond, before she could process the full implications of what he was saying, the back door of the diner burst open, and Gordon appeared, looking frazzled. "You need to see this," he said urgently, holding up his phone. "Both of you." Lydia's heart sank as she looked at the screen. It was a gossip website, and the headline made her blood run cold. "Fake romance exposed. Julian Cross's girlfriend is just a publicity stunt." The article was brutal, filled with anonymous quotes from sources close to Cross Holdings, suggesting that Lydia was a hired actress, that their relationship was a carefully orchestrated campaign to improve Julian's image before the launch of his affordable housing project. "She's nothing more than a prop," says one insider familiar with Cross's business practices. "Julian's team specifically sought out a working-class woman to humanize his brand. The timing is too convenient to be coincidental." Lydia felt sick as she read quote after quote, each one painting her as either a calculating gold digger or a naive pawn in Julian's corporate games. The worst part was that some of the details were accurate. The timing of their public debut, the fact that Julian's company was indeed launching an affordable housing initiative. Even small details about their first meeting that no reporter should have known. "How do they know all this?" she whispered. Julian's face was like stone as he scrolled through the article. "Someone's been talking. Someone with inside information. Who would do this? I can think of a few candidates." Julian's voice was dangerous, the kind of controlled fury that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. "Catherine, for one. She has connections at half the gossip rags in the city." "It doesn't matter who," Lydia said, though her voice was shaking. "The damage is done. Everyone's going to believe this. Not everyone, the people who matter, will think I'm either a fraud or an idiot." Lydia finished. "Julian, I can't do this. I can't live under this kind of scrutiny, never knowing what's going to be twisted or taken out of context." "So what are you saying?" Lydia looked at him standing there in his expensive suit, his hair perfect, despite the humidity, every inch the successful businessman he was. Then she looked down at her uniform, stained with coffee and smelling like grease, her hands rough from years of manual labor. The gulf between their worlds had never seemed wider. "I'm saying maybe everyone's right," she said quietly. "Maybe this was doomed from the start." "Lydia, no. Look at us, Julian. Really look. You're worried about corporate image and media strategy. I'm worried about whether I can afford groceries this week. We're not from the same world, and pretending otherwise is just going to hurt both of us." Julian stepped toward her, his hands reaching out as if to touch her, but she stepped back. The hurt that flashed across his face nearly broke her resolve, but she forced herself to continue. I think we should end this now, before it gets any worse. Is that what you really want? No, her heart screamed. What she wanted was for none of this to matter, for them to be just Julian and Lydia, without the weight of expectations and social complications. But wanting something and being able to have it were two very different things. I think it's what's best, she said instead. Julian stared at her for a long moment, and she watched something close off in his expression. The vulnerability that had been there moments before disappeared behind the polished mask of the businessman she'd first met. If that's how you feel, he said formally, then I'll respect your decision. The words were exactly what she'd expected, but they still felt like a knife to the chest. Part of her had hoped he would fight harder, would find some way to convince her that they could make this work, despite everything. Instead, he was already stepping back, putting distance between them both physically and emotionally. Julian, she started, not sure what she wanted to say. I should go, he said quietly. The reporters will have moved on by now. You can get back to your normal life. He turned and walked toward the street, and Lydia watched him go with her heart breaking into smaller and smaller pieces. At the mouth of the alley he paused and looked back. For what it's worth, he said, it was real for me. All of it. Then he was gone, leaving Lydia alone in the alley, with nothing but the lingering scent of his cologne and the memory of what might have been. She stood there for several minutes, trying to collect herself enough to go back inside and face the curious stares and whispered conversations. When she finally did, she moved through the rest of her shift like a robot, taking orders and serving food while her mind replayed every moment of their brief relationship. Had it been real? Or had she been naive enough to fall for an elaborate performance designed to make Julian Cross seem more relatable to the masses? Looking at the napkin he'd left behind, her poem, carefully folded and obviously treasured, Lydia wanted to believe it had been real. But in a world where everything was calculated and nothing was private, how could she be sure? That night, she went home to her empty apartment and cried for what felt like hours, mourning not just the end of their relationship, but the death of the fairy tale she'd allowed herself to believe in. Outside her window, the city hummed with its usual energy, indifferent to her heartbreak. Somewhere out there, Julian Cross was probably back in his penthouse, back to his world of board meetings and business deals, already forgetting about the waitress who'd briefly complicated his life. And Lydia was back where she'd started, alone, ordinary, and wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. 2 weeks passed in a blur of routine and regret. Lydia threw herself into her work at the diner, picking up extra shifts and staying late to avoid going home to her empty apartment, where every surface seemed to remind her of Julian. The media attention had died down, just as he'd predicted it would. But the absence of cameras and reporters only made her more aware of his absence. She tried to write, filling pages with angry poetry about heartbreak and fairy tales that turned to ash, but nothing felt right. Every word seemed hollow, like she was performing her own emotions rather than feeling them. It was a rainy Thursday evening when everything changed. Lydia was wiping down tables after the dinner rush when the door chimed, admitting a figure in an expensive coat that made her heart stop. For a wild moment she thought Julian had come back, but then the woman turned and Lydia saw the cold beauty of Catherine Blackwood. "Well, hello, darling," Catherine said with a smile that could have cut glass. "I was hoping we could have a little chat." "We have nothing to talk about," Lydia replied, continuing to clean tables with hands that were definitely not shaking. "Oh, I think we do." Catherine slid into a booth uninvited, her designer handbag placed precisely beside her. "You see, I have something of a confession to make." Despite her better judgment, Lydia found herself pausing. "What kind of confession?" "The kind that might interest you, given how spectacularly your little romance imploded." Catherine's smile widened. "You do know it was all fake, don't you? Julian's feelings, the spontaneous meetings, even that charming first encounter at this very diner. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? Tell me, darling. Did Julian ever mention that he'd been having lunch here every day for a week before you threw yourself into his arms? Lydia's blood turned to ice. That's not true, isn't it? He'd been watching you, studying your patterns, learning your schedule. The whole rescue was carefully orchestrated to make you feel like you owed him something. You're lying. Catherine pulled out her phone and scrolled through what looked like text messages. These are from Julian's assistant. Well, former assistant. She was quite chatty after Julian fired half his staff in a fit of rage last week. She held up the phone so Lydia could read. JC wants surveillance on the Martinez woman. Daily schedules, work patterns, personal habits. Discreet observation only. He's been to that diner 6 times this week. Should I book his usual table? Boss says to arrange the coincidental meeting for Thursday. Make sure the timing looks natural. The words swam before Lydia's eyes. It couldn't be true. The connection she'd felt with Julian, the way he'd looked at her, the poem he'd kept. None of it could have been fake. I can see you're struggling with this, Catherine continued with false sympathy. It must be difficult to learn that everything you thought was real was actually just a very expensive performance. Why are you telling me this? Because I want Julian back, and as long as you're in his head, that's not going to happen. He's been absolutely miserable since you ended things. Pacing his office, snapping at employees, drinking too much at social events. It's really quite pathetic. Catherine leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But here's the thing, darling. Julian's misery isn't because he loves you. It's because he's not used to losing. You were a project that got away from him, and he can't stand that you figured out his game before he was finished playing it. Get out, Lydia said quietly. Excuse me. Get out of this diner. Now. Catherine's smile faltered slightly. I'm just trying to help you see the truth. The truth? Lydia set down her cleaning cloth and fixed Catherine with a stare that would have made Gordon proud. The truth is that you're a bitter woman who can't stand that the man you wanted chose someone else. The truth is that you're so desperate to get Julian back that you're willing to lie and manipulate and destroy other people's happiness. The truth, Lydia continued, her voice growing stronger, is that whatever Julian felt for me was real enough to scare you. Otherwise, why would you be here? Catherine's face flushed with anger. You think you're so special, don't you? Just because he slummed it with you for a few weeks? I think, a familiar voice said from behind them, that you should leave. Both women turned to see Julian standing just inside the door, water dripping from his coat and his expression thunderous. He looked terrible. Exhausted, unshaven, with the kind of hollowed-out appearance that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. Julian, Catherine's voice immediately shifted to honey-sweet tones. Perfect timing. I was just explaining to your little waitress here how these things really work. Catherine. Julian's voice was deadly quiet as he stepped closer to their booth. I'm going to say this once, and I want you to listen very carefully. If you ever come near Lydia again, if you ever speak to her or about her, if you even think about interfering in her life in any way, I will destroy you. Catherine laughed, but it sounded forced. Don't be ridiculous, you don't mean that. Try me. Julian's smile was sharp as a blade. I have enough evidence of your insider trading activities to put you in federal prison for the next 10 years. The only reason I haven't already given it to the SEC is because I thought you weren't worth the effort. But if you continue to harass the woman I love, I'll be happy to reconsider that position. The words "woman I love" shocked Lydia. She stared at Julian, seeing something in his face that made her chest tight with hope and terror. Catherine must have seen it too, because she was suddenly scrambling out of the booth. This isn't over, she hissed. Yes, Julian said calmly, it is. After Catherine left, the diner became silence. Julian stood by the booth, his hands in his pockets, looking uncertain for the first time since Lydia had known him. "How much did you hear?" she asked finally. "Enough." Julian's jaw was tight with anger. "None of what she said was true, Lydia. I need you to know that." "Wasn't it?" "The surveillance, the planned meetings. I came to the diner because I wanted to see you again," Julian said quietly. "After that first night, I couldn't stop thinking about you. Yes, I had my assistant check your work schedule, but not because I was running some kind of elaborate con, because I was terrified that if I just showed up randomly, I'd miss you." "Julian, I know how it looks. I know Catherine made it sound manipulative. But Lydia, everything between us was real. The attraction, the connection, the way you made me feel like I could be someone better than who I've been. All of it was real." Lydia wanted to believe him. Every cell in her body was screaming at her to believe him. But the seeds of doubt Catherine had planted were growing, fed by weeks of insecurity and self-protection. "How can I know for sure?" she whispered. "How can I trust that any of this is real when your whole world runs on manipulation and strategy?" Julian stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Because I'm willing to give it all up." "What?" "My company, my social standing, the money, all of it. If that's what it takes to prove that you're more important to me than any of those things, I'll walk away from everything." Lydia felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." Julian stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion and desperation in his eyes. "I've spent the last 2 weeks trying to figure out how to live without you, and I can't. I don't want to." "Julian, you're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. Lydia, I love you. Not because you're a project or a publicity stunt or anything else Catherine might have said. I love you because you're brave and funny and real in ways that make everyone else in my life seem like shadows." The words hung between them, raw and honest and terrifying in their intensity. Lydia felt tears pricking at her eyes, her carefully constructed defenses crumbling under the weight of his sincerity. "I love you too," she whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep in her chest. "But Julian, love isn't enough. The differences between our worlds are just details." Julian reached out, his hands framing her face with gentle fingers. "We'll figure out the details. Together. What if we can't? What if the pressure and the scrutiny and the expectations are too much? Then we'll face that together too. But Lydia, we have to try. What we have is too rare, too precious to throw away because we're scared." Looking into his eyes, seeing the love and hope and desperation there, Lydia felt the last of her resistance breaking down. Maybe fairy tales could happen to waitresses from Queens. Maybe love really could conquer all the practical obstacles that seemed so insurmountable. Maybe Julian Cross was worth the risk of having her heart broken again. "Okay," she breathed. "Okay, let's try. Let's see if we can make this work." Julian's smile was brilliant with relief and joy. When he kissed her this time, it tasted like promises and second chances.